this happened at Big Creek Trailhead in the Great Smoky Mountains, and I swear it's the scariest hike I'll ever take. I followed a normal trail, but ended up in something ancient and wrong, with spirals carved into the rocks, faceless figures watching from the trees, and a hum that felt like it was inside my chest. This isn't just a creepy camping story or a random paranormal encounter. This was real Appalachian horror, and if you've ever hiked these woods at night, you'll know exactly why I'll never go back. You're listening to ASMR 404Found. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. So this happened last fall when I drove up to the Big Creek Trailhead in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on October 14th, 2022 at 6:37 p.m. The sun was dropping low behind the ridges, and the whole sky had that soft bruise-colored wash that comes right before twilight really settles in, and the shadows were already stretched long across the gravel parking lot, where I rolled in with a thermos of gas station coffee and a pack that felt heavier than it should have because I was both excited and nervous about doing an overnight out there on my own. I remember the air smelled sharp and wet, like leaves that had been pressed into the earth for weeks, and the creek that runs near the trailhead was roaring so loud it almost swallowed up the sound of my car door slamming shut. And for a second, I stood there with my keys in my hand, thinking about how different the forest feels at night compared to during the day, and I told myself I had to shake that off, or I would psych myself out before I even started. There were only 2 other cars in the lot, one of them an old Subaru with a North Carolina plate, and the other a beat-up truck with Tennessee tags, mud caked up to the wheel wells, and I figured whoever they belonged to was already way up the trail, probably setting up camp near Walnut Bottoms or further along toward the Mount Sterling Ridge, so I should have had the lower part of the trail to myself. And that gave me a weird mix of comfort and dread because the Smokies are big enough that you can go hours without seeing another soul. And sometimes that solitude feels pure and perfect, but other times it presses down on you, like you are being watched by everything around you. I pulled on my pack and walked toward the information board at the head of the trail, where people tack up missing dog flyers and weather notices, and the paper was all curled with damp. And there was one old flyer still clinging under a thumbtack about a guy who had gone missing earlier in the summer, and I remembered hearing about it on the local news. Some hiker in his 30s who supposedly never made it back out from a solo trip, and the ranger quoted had just said vague things about how dangerous it is to hike alone, especially if storms roll in unexpectedly, and the family had offered a reward, but there had never been any follow-up on whether they found him. That memory stuck with me as I started walking up the path, the crunch of gravel giving way to packed dirt and the sound of Big Creek, always just to my left, rushing and foaming and echoing in that narrow valley, and the forest already looked darker than it should have, considering the time of day. the canopy so dense it swallowed the last gold light and replaced it with a dim green shadow world where every branch looked like it was reaching down to snag at my shoulders. I kept telling myself this was fine. This was just the beginning. Jitters, everybody feels them. And my plan was simple: hike in a couple miles, find a flat spot near the creek to throw up my tent, cook some ramen and crash early so I could wake up with the dawn and push up toward Mouse Creek Falls, then maybe Mount Sterling if the weather held. But as soon as I rounded the first bend and the parking lot disappeared behind me, that familiar silence settled in the kind you only hear deep in the woods, where no cars, no planes, no distant houses break it, and all that fills the air is the low breathing of the forest itself. It was about 20 minutes in when I noticed the first thing that made my stomach tighten. It was just a tree. At first glance, a big tulip poplar leaning out over the trail with bark scarred by what I thought were old claw marks from a bear, or maybe just storm damage. But when I stopped and shined my headlamp at it, the gouges didn't look like claw marks at all. They were too straight, too deliberate, like someone had dragged a blade downward again and again, carving deep parallel lines that ended just above eye level, and the wood beneath was pale and raw, like it had been cut recently. I swallowed hard and kept moving, telling myself people carve things into trees all the time. Initials, hearts, dumb symbols. But as I went further, I kept seeing more of them, not just one or two, but dozens lining the trail on both sides, each tree showing those same parallel grooves, sometimes 3 or 4, sometimes a whole fan of them spreading down the trunk. And the strangest thing was, they were all at the exact same height, all fresh, all pointing downward, as if whatever made them wanted to remind anyone walking by that the forest was marked and claimed. The deeper I went, the more the sounds shifted too. Big Creek was still rumbling, but underneath it, there came this low droning hum, almost like wind passing through a hollow. But it wasn't windy. The leaves were barely moving overhead, and yet the hum came and went in pulses almost in rhythm with my footsteps, so that I couldn't tell if I was hearing it with my ears or just feeling it under my skin. By the time I reached the first footbridge, crossing a side stream, the sky had gone nearly black, and I clicked on my headlamp, its beam cutting a cone through the dark, and the water below the bridge shone like liquid glass. But the reflection that came back up at me didn't look right. It was my silhouette, sure, but stretched tall and thin, far taller than I am, and the arms of it reached down into the stream instead of holding my trekking poles. And for a second, I almost leaned over, thinking maybe it was the angle. But then the shadows had tilted before I moved my own, and I stumbled forward across the bridge without looking down again. My pulse was hammering in my neck, but I forced myself to breathe slow and steady, telling myself it was just tired eyes, tricks of the water and the lamp. But the humming under my skin had grown stronger, like it was rising up from the ground into the soles of my boots. And I thought about turning back right there, but pride kept me pushing forward, because nothing had actually happened, nothing tangible. And I didn't want to be the guy who spooked himself into retreat. After less than a mile, I don't know how long I walked after that, maybe another hour, maybe less time in the dark stretches like sap thick and slow. But eventually I found a flat spot near a bend in the creek where the trees opened just enough to let me set up my tent on soft pine needles, and I dropped my back with relief, though the hum didn't stop, even when I stood still. It was there in the silence like a pressure wave that only I could hear. I cooked ramen with shaking hands, my little stove hissing while the creek roared, and every now and then I would flick my headlamp into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there watching. But the beam only showed trunks and leaves, and those carved gouges that seemed to shine back at me like wet scars in the bark. And when I finally crawled into my tent, I thought maybe sleep would break the spell. But as I zipped the door shut, I realized the hum was inside the tent, too, vibrating in the fabric like the whole forest was pressing its breath against me. And when I closed my eyes, I could swear I heard whispers threading through it. Not words I could understand, but long-drawn syllables, stretched like the reflections in the stream. And with every passing second, I felt less like I was alone in the woods and more like I had stepped into something's home and it knew I was there. That was the first night at Big Creek Trailhead, and it was only the beginning. I didn't sleep much that first night. The hum never went away. It clung to the inside of my skull like a mosquito whine, except heavier lower, like a deep engine running just below hearing range. And every time I started to drift, my dreams jerked me awake again, and each dream was the same. I was walking through the forest, but the trail wasn't where it should be. It twisted in ways that didn't belong, and every tree I passed had the carved gouges running down them. But in the dream, they weren't just scars. They were openings breathing in and out like ribs lifting and falling. And as I moved past them, something slid just behind the trunks, tall and bending like the stretched reflection I had seen in the water. When I woke for the third or fourth time, the nylon of the tent was wet with dew, or maybe with the breath of the creek. I couldn't tell. And the whispering had gotten clearer. It was definitely voices now, rising and falling like a chant, just at the edge of what I could understand. And though I knew it had to be the creek tricking my ears, I could have sworn they were saying my name, dragging it out, syllable by syllable, like they were tasting the sound of it. I lay there with my eyes wide open in the dark until, finally, a thin gray light filtered through the tent wall, and I knew dawn had come, and that saved me, because the hum faded with the light, not gone entirely, but softer, drowned under the normal morning sounds of birds starting up their calls and squirrels rustling through the underbrush. I crawled out of the tent with my throat dry and my legs stiff, and the first thing I noticed was that the gouges in the nearest tree looked deeper than I remembered from the night before. Raw wood flayed back in strips as though something had come through in the dark and carved them further while I slept. And though I told myself maybe I had just not looked closely enough, I packed up faster than usual, eager to put distance between me and that place. The trail climbed steadily upward, past mossy stones and roots, slick with the night's moisture, and the roar of Big Creek carried on beside me, though now it seemed to pulse again, almost in rhythm with my steps, and I found myself quickening my pace to break the beat, only for it to catch up again until I felt like the forest was matching me, stride for stride. About 2 miles in, I came across something strange. It was a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across, where the trees opened up and the ground was littered with feathers, not from one bird, but dozens, maybe hundreds, all pale gray and white like doves or pigeons, and they were scattered in a ring as though something had dropped them from above and arranged them without leaving a single carcass behind. The air smelled metallic, sharp like pennies left to rust in water, and when I crouched to touch one of the feathers, it crumbled in my hand like ash, even though it looked whole. I didn't stay there long because the hum grew louder in the clearing, as if the absence of trees made it swell into the open air, and by the time I stepped back under the canopy, I felt lightheaded like I had been breathing thin oxygen on a mountaintop, and I kept moving uphill, my mouth dry, my heart racing with no real exertion to explain it. It was around noon when I reached the junction near the Baxter Creek Trail, and there I finally saw another person, or at least I thought I did. At first, there was movement ahead, a figure standing by the signpost where the trail split, but as I got closer, the figure didn't move, didn't shift or wave or step aside. It just stood there, tall and narrow, shoulders drawn up under a hood that looked too long, too pointed, like it was sagging forward. And when I lifted a hand to wave, the figure melted backward behind the signpost and was gone before I could take another step. I rushed to the junction, expecting maybe another backpacker, maybe someone coming down from Mount Sterling, but when I got there, the trail was empty, the dirt undisturbed, and there were no footprints, no sound of branches swaying from where they might have slipped away, just silence, and the low, steady hum thrumming stronger than ever, as though it was pleased. I had seen what it wanted me to see. I ate lunch sitting on a log near the junction, trying to steady my nerves, forcing down a protein bar and water. But every time I glanced back at the signpost, I half expected the figure to be there again, watching with that sagging hood hiding its face, and I finally packed up and pushed further along, deciding to head for Walnut Bottoms, where I knew there was an old backcountry campsite, and maybe even someone else camped for the night. The trail narrowed as it wound upward, and the creek fell further below, and the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees bent over the trail, not in the normal graceful arcs of maples or oaks, but twisted at odd angles, as though they were craning downward to listen, and the gouges kept appearing on their trunks, each one fresher, each one deeper, and some of them even seeping a dark resin that smelled sour, like burnt sugar. By late afternoon, the sky had gone dim again, though my watch said it was only 4:30, and I felt the air grow colder, like I had stepped into a different elevation, even though the map said I was barely higher than before. And then I saw something on the trailhead that froze me in place. It was a backpack torn open, with its contents spilled across the dirt. A sleeping bag half unrolled, a crushed water bottle, a pair of boots lying on their sides, like the person had stepped right out of them and vanished. I recognized the brand on the backpack too. It was the same one from the missing hiker flyer pinned back at the trailhead. Same faded blue color, same fraying straps. And when I knelt to touch it, the hum surged so loud in my head that I staggered backward, clutching my temples. And in that moment, I swore I heard words in it. Real words, not just noise. And they said, "Not yours, not yours, not yours." I left the pack where it lay and hurried on my legs, shaking worse than any steep climb should have caused. And all the while I felt eyes on me from the sides of the trail, from the gaps between the trees, though every time I flicked my headlamp sideways there was nothing but trunks and leaves, except sometimes for just a fraction of a second. I thought I saw shapes tall and thin, bent at odd angles, like they couldn't quite fit between the trees, and their faces, if they had faces, were always turned away, just enough that I could never catch them by. The time I stumbled into Walnut Bottoms, the light had almost fully bled out of the sky, and the clearing looked wrong, twisted as though the trees had leaned further in since the last time I had been there years ago. And though the campsite posts were still standing, the fire rings were filled with damp ash that smelled fresh. Not weeks old like it should have, but hours, as if someone had just left, and the ground was stamped with prints. Not boot prints, not animal prints, but long dragged impressions, like something had slithered upright across the soil, leaving trails that coiled and looped in spirals. I didn't set my tent up right away. I just stood in the middle of the clearing, turning in circles, trying to decide if it was safer to stay there or push on deeper into the dark. But the hum had grown so powerful, it was shaking my ribs like bass from a speaker pressed against my chest. And I knew there was no easy choice because whatever was in the Smokies had already noticed me, and it wasn't about to let me go without pulling me further into whatever lay at the heart of those carved trees. That night at Walnut Bottoms was worse than the first, because sleep never came at all. I stayed awake that whole night at Walnut Bottoms, because every time I closed my eyes, the hum swelled, and the whispers pushed closer, and there was no mistaking it anymore. They were circling me, threading in and out of the trees around the clearing, and sometimes they rose together like a chorus, and sometimes they dropped to single voices, muttering sharp and quick, but always they kept their rhythm with the hum, like the forest itself was breathing words through its scars. I sat by the cold fire ring, clutching my headlamp in one hand and my knife in the other, though I knew neither would make a difference if something really came out of the dark, and I kept swinging the beam through the trees, trying to catch them. But the moment the light hit the trunks, the shapes vanished just beyond reach, tall and thin, always bent, as though hiding behind bark, too narrow to hold them. But I knew they were there because every so often the gouged trees would flex slightly, like something was pressing against them from inside, and the resin would drip thicker, like sap bleeding in time with the hum. The hours crawled until the sky finally began to pale with dawn, and though the voices receded, the damage was done. My nerves were shot and my body ached with exhaustion, and the worst part was when the sun rose high enough for me to see clearly. I realized the clearing looked different than it had the night before. The campsite posts were gone, as though they had never been there. No cut wood, no ash rings, no signs of human use at all. Only a raw circle of bare soil in the middle of the forest. And I knew I had not imagined those posts, because I had leaned against one when I first arrived. But there was nothing left now, except the spiraling tracks pressed into the dirt, like something had slithered and dragged and twisted in slow circles all around me, while I sat awake clutching my knife. I thought about turning back, then I really did, but my legs carried me forward up the Big Creek Trail toward Mount Sterling, like I was being pulled by a hook sunk deep in my chest, and every step only made the hum louder, until I could barely tell where my heartbeat ended and the vibration began. The trail grew steeper, climbing into switchbacks, and the trees closed in tighter above until the sky was nothing but a gray strip, barely visible between branches, and the air thinned and chilled as if the mountain was draining the warmth from my skin. And somewhere along the climb, I noticed something carved into the dirt itself, symbols gouged into the path with sharp edges, like runes or letters I didn't recognize. They weren't random either. They repeated at intervals, always in clusters of 3, with lines slashing downward and curling hooks at their base. And when I bent to touch one, the earth was warm, as though something still smoldered beneath the soil. I pulled my hand back quick, but the warmth clung to my palm like it had branded me, and as I climbed higher, the symbols became more frequent until the trail looked less like a hiking path and more like a corridor marked deliberately to guide or trap or claim anyone foolish enough to keep walking. By the time I reached the ridgeline, the day had gone dim again, though my watch said it was only mid-afternoon, and the wind had picked up whipping cold through the trees. But it wasn't like normal mountain wind. There was no rhythm to it, no gust then lull, just a constant push that carried with it the same low droning note as the And I realized then that it wasn't just under my skin anymore. It was in the air itself, rattling the branches and stones, and even the bones inside my chest. The Mount Sterling fire tower should have been visible as I came around the last stretch of ridge. But instead, what I saw first was movement. Tall shapes gliding between the trees, ahead faster than I could track them, thin and pale against the dark trunks. And for the first time, I caught a glimpse of their faces, or what passed for faces, flat and featureless, except for the gouges carved across them. 3 lines dragging down from where eyes should have been to where a mouth should end, and those lines glowed faintly like coals beneath bark. I froze, and the shapes froze too, and for a long moment we just stood across the trail from each other, the forest holding its breath, the hum so loud it made my teeth ache. And then as I blinked, they bent backward in impossible angles, melting into the trunks until the ridge looked empty again. But I could feel them still there, pressed thin against the bark, waiting for me to move. I forced myself forward, my legs trembling, and the tower finally came into view, its steel frame rising out of the trees like a skeleton against the bruised sky. And though I had planned to camp near it and climb for the view, I knew the moment I saw it that I could not stay long, because even from a distance, I could hear it groaning, not from wind, but from something inside its beams, a slow, bending, metallic wail that matched the hume's rhythm perfectly. When I reached the base, I looked down and my stomach turned, because the ground beneath the tower was carved just like the trail, covered in spirals and lines, radiating outward, as though the tower stood on the center of a web, and the soil was blackened and cracked in places, like it had been scorched, though no fire had ever swept this ridge, and the smell rising from it was sharp and sweet, like overripe fruit rotting in the heat. I almost turned back right then, but exhaustion pinned me, and I knew I needed rest, even if only for an hour. So I climbed the metal stairs, each step ringing in time with a hum. And when I reached the top platform, I saw the entire forest spread out below, and for a moment I thought maybe the daylight would clear my head, but the view only made it worse because the canopy wasn't green anymore. It was gray and rippling like the surface of a pond, and beneath it I could see shapes moving, hundreds of them, thin and tall, bending as if they were waiting for night to fall, so they could rise fully into the open. I pressed myself against the railing and shut my eyes tight, but when I opened them again, the shapes were gone. The forest looked normal, the ridges rolling blue in the distance, the valleys cut deep and shadowed, and for a second, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But then, I looked down at the metal floor beneath my boots and saw fresh gouges cut into the steel, 3 lines parallel, dragging from one side of the platform to the other, and I knew nothing could have done that without me hearing it, unless it was already here. Before I even arrived, that night I didn't bother with the tent. I curled up on the tower floor with my back to the rail, my knife clutched tight and the hum shaking the steel until it felt like the whole mountain was breathing beneath me. And when the voices rose again, whispering my name from the trees below, I finally whispered back, not out of bravery, but out of exhaustion, because I knew they were going to keep whispering whether I answered or not. And the moment the word had left my lips, the forest went silent. The hum cut out, like someone had flipped a switch, and in that silence I realized how much worse it was without the noise, because now I could hear footsteps climbing the stairs. The first step I heard on the metal stairs of the fire tower was slow, deliberate, and heavy enough that it rang through the steel like a tuning fork, and I told myself it was just another hiker, maybe someone who had come up late and wanted the view, but the hair on the back of my neck was already standing, and the knife in my hand felt useless against whatever was rising toward me, because those footsteps didn't match the pace of a human climb. They dragged too long between each note, like the legs taking them were taller than mine too, tall to fit on the stairs comfortably. I pressed myself into the corner of the platform, trying to make myself small, though I knew there was nowhere to go but down, and the humming had returned, low and deep, thrumming up through the tower's skeleton, and it joined with the rhythm of the steps, so that the whole structure felt like a drum, beating out a summons. And when I finally forced myself to peek over the grated floor, I saw a shadow stretched up the stairs, but not like a normal shadow. This one clung to the underside of the steps, as if the light itself had bent wrong to cast it there. It rose higher with each dragging footfall, until it was only one flight below, and then it stopped, and the tower went still, so still that even the wind died, and I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. And in that silence, something spoke, not out loud, not even in the whispering voices I had heard in the woods, but directly inside my chest, and it said, "You answered now. We come." The moment I heard that, the shadow on the stairs dissolved into the metal, like water sinking into dry ground, and the hum inside the tower spiked so loud that the bolts rattled and I thought the whole structure might tear apart. But then it softened again into that steady vibration that had haunted me since Big Creek, and I realized nothing had climbed up at all. The sound of footsteps had been for me, only for me to hear and to answer. I stayed awake until dawn again, barely daring to close my eyes. And when the sun came up, the forest below looked almost normal except for the trees directly around the tower. Their trunks gleamed with new gouges, the fresh wood shining pale and raw, as if something had circled all night, carving deeper and deeper, each mark perfectly aligned with the others, like they were part of a design too large for me to see from where I stood. My body ached with exhaustion, but I knew I couldn't stay on the tower any longer. So I packed up what little I had left and started down the ridge toward the Cataloochee side, thinking maybe I could cut across toward the road and hitch back to my car. But the trail felt different now, twisted in subtle ways that didn't match the map in my head. Switchbacks longer, descents steeper, and every time I checked my compass, the needle jittered as though it couldn't decide where north really was. After an hour of stumbling, I came across a tree split wide down the middle, like lightning had struck it, but the inside wasn't charred. It was hollow and pulsing as though something inside was breathing, and from that hollow came a smell like old meat turned sweet in the sun. And when I leaned closer against my better judgment, I thought I saw fingers pale and too long, curling just inside the wood, then withdrawing as if they knew I had seen them. I ran then, not caring if I lost the trail, crashing through laurel and rhododendron until my legs burned, and when I finally stopped to catch my breath, I found myself back on the trail again, though I had no idea how I had rejoined it. The dirt beneath me carved with those same 3-line symbols, repeating over and over like the mountain had folded me back into its path, whether I wanted it or not. By late afternoon, I stumbled into a narrow saddle between ridges, where the forest floor was carpeted with bones, not large ones, not deer or bear, but small, delicate ones, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scattered across the ground like leaves, skulls no bigger than a thumb, long, thin ribs, brittle spines, and every one of them bleached perfectly white, as though they had been cleaned and placed here deliberately. The sight of it made my stomach clench, and when I knelt to pick one up, it dissolved into powder between my fingers, just like the feathers had the day before. As I crouched there, the air grew colder, and the hum rose again, and from the corner of my vision, I saw them standing between the trees, tall, thin, their carved faces glowing faintly. And this time, they didn't hide. When I turned my head, they stayed in place, ringed around the saddle, watching with their heads tilted slightly, as if curious. And though my fears screamed at me to run, my legs locked in place, and I could only stare back until one of them lifted its arm impossibly long, jointed in the wrong places, and pointed down the trail. I don't know why, but I obeyed. I walked where it pointed, and the others followed, at a distance, gliding between the trunks, never rushing, never closing the space, but always there on either side, until the sun dipped low, and the forest grew darker and darker, and I realized they were herding me like wolves, driving prey along a path, and the thought lodged deep that maybe I had never been lost at all. Maybe the trail itself had been theirs all along, and I was only walking where they wanted me. As night fell, I reached another clearing smaller than walnut bottoms, but marked with a ring of stones stacked into spirals, each stone carved with those same three-line symbols. And at the center stood a post taller than me, carved from a tree trunk, stripped of bark and flayed with hundreds of gouges. And when I touched it against all reason, it was warm, too, warm like flesh, and the hum was no longer outside me. It was inside now, rattling my bones and making my teeth ache, and I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the whispers rose all around. They spoke in unison this time, dozens, maybe hundreds of voices, layered together, saying the same phrase again and again. Not yours, not yours, not yours, until my stomach turned and bile rose in my throat. And then suddenly they stopped, leaving the clearing, silent except for my ragged breath. And in that silence I understood they were not talking to me. They were talking about me, because something else was here, something bigger that the hum belonged to. And whatever it was, they were warning it that I did not belong. I crawled out of that clearing on hands and knees, too weak to stand at first. And when I finally forced myself back to my feet, I realized the forest had gone utterly quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the rush of water. And in that stillness, every step echoed like I was walking inside a cave. And though I knew I was still miles from Big Creek Trailhead, I felt sure that if I turned around, the trail behind me would no longer be the Smokies at all, but something deeper, older, and wrong. I walked through the night unable to stop, driven by the fear that if I paused even for a breath, the voices would return, and the shapes would close the distance they had left between us. And all the while the gouged trees lined the path closer together, now their scars glowing faintly in the dark like lanterns marking the way. And I realized the deeper I went, the less the forest that belonged to itself, the less it belonged to anything human, and the more it became theirs by dawn. I was shaking with exhaustion, my throat raw from breathing the cold air. And when I finally collapsed against a tree, I saw it was carved too, but not with 3 lines instead. It bore a symbol I hadn't seen before, A spiral crossed through with a jagged slash, and when I touched it, voice clear and sharp cut through the hum, a different voice than the others, saying turn back now. When that sharp voice cut through the hum, telling me to turn back now, it hit me like cold water thrown in my face, and for a second I almost wept with relief, because it was different from the others. It wasn't layered and droning, it wasn't stretched or warped. It was clear and human sounding. And though I knew I was alone in those woods, I looked around desperate to see who had spoken, but the trail was empty. Just the carved trees lined up on either side, glowing faintly in the dim, gray light. I pressed my palm to the spiral and slash carved into the bark, and the warmth that had clung to every other mark was absent. This one was cold, so cold it burned, and when I pulled my hand away, my skin was pale and bloodless where it had touched, as if the tree had drawn something out of me. I wrapped my fingers tight around the handle of my trekking pole, trying to bring the color back, and in that moment, the hum dipped low again, almost retreating, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, this mark was a kind of shield, something cut into the forest, not by them, but against them. That thought carried me forward for another mile or two, though the terrain had changed again, without my noticing the trail narrowing into a trench flanked by ridges of root and stone that rose like walls on either side, and the air pressed heavier with each step until I felt like I was walking underwater. The hum muffled, thickened, but never gone, and the trees leaned in so close, their branches wove together overhead, blocking out what little daylight had broken through the morning mist. I kept glancing back at the spiral slash symbol burned into my mind, wondering if I would see another, but for a long time, there was nothing, only the endless repetition of the 3 lines carved into bark stone, even dirt, and the faint resin smell that followed me like smoke from a fire that was always just behind me, but never visible. Then the trench opened into another clearing, though this one wasn't natural. The ground was too flat, too deliberate, and at its center stood a structure made of stone, stacked without mortar. A rough altar, maybe waist-high and covered in gouges. The same 3 lines, but deeper cut straight through the rock surface, and seeping a black ooze that smelled of iron and rot. And when I leaned closer, I saw that it wasn't ooze at all. It was blood thick and fresh. As though the cuts had just been made, I staggered back, gagging, and when I lifted my head, I realized I was not alone. The clearing was ringed with them, tall, thin, bending, wrong their faceless heads carved with the same glowing gouges. And they didn't move. They didn't step closer. They only swayed slightly in unison, like reeds in water, and the hum rose sharp enough to rattle my teeth until I dropped to my knees, clutching my skull, and through it all I heard the layered chorus again. Not yours. Not yours. not yours. This time, though, another voice cut through the chorus, the same sharp one from before, and it said, "Run." I didn't hesitate. I scrambled to my feet and bolted across the clearing, the shapes swaying harder now, the hum clawing at my bones, but none of them stepped forward. They only turned their heads as I passed, their carved faces watching me go, and the air seemed to thin slightly as I burst back into the trench like I had broken through a membrane stretched across the clearing. I didn't stop running until my lungs were on fire, and even then, I kept a stumbling pace, afraid that if I slowed, they would surround me again. And when I finally collapsed against another tree, I saw the spiral slash carved into its trunk, cold against my back, and I realized the voice that had cut through must have been tied to these symbols, like someone had left them behind as warnings or beacons, and I wasn't the first to come this way. That thought sank into me heavy and dark, because if someone else had left these marks, they had been here long enough to carve dozens, maybe hundreds, into the trees and stones and dirt. And yet, I had never heard of anyone surviving an encounter like this. In the Smokies, the missing hiker flyer at the trailhead flashed in my mind, and I wondered if he had been the one carving, if he had found a way to resist, and if so, where had he ended up? Because the search teams had never brought him back. The trail bent downward into a hollow, and I smelled water before I heard it. A stagnant pond hidden deep in the woods, its surface black and still reflecting nothing, though the sky above was brighter now. And when I leaned over the bank, I realized the water wasn't reflecting, because it wasn't water at all. It was liquid, as dark as tar, thick and unmoving. And when a breeze stirred, the trees above the surface did not ripple. It only bulged slightly, like something beneath was pressing upward to meet me. I stumbled back, and in the corner of my vision, I caught movement. A figure kneeling at the edge of the pond, pale hands pressed into the dark liquid, and when I blinked, it was gone, leaving only the gouged marks along the bank, 3 lines carved into the mud, each one filled with the same tar, like liquid, as though the earth itself was bleeding. I pushed on, hard hammering, legs weak, and the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to thin, the trees taller, farther apart. But every trunk carved, every stone marked, and always the hum chasing me. Never ahead, never behind, but inside me, rattling every breath and step until I felt like if I peeled back my skin, I would find the marks carved into my bones. By late afternoon, I came upon a cabin, or what was left, of one hidden in a fold of the ridge. The roof half caved, the walls rotted but still standing enough to show that people had once lived here long ago, maybe loggers or rangers, and I thought for a second I might find shelter inside. But the moment I stepped across the threshold, the hum swelled into a shriek, and the air dropped 20 degrees in an instant. frost blooming across the rotten wood, and I saw them inside, not shapes this time, but shadows, dozens pressed into the corners, clinging to the walls like mildew, and all of them turned their carved faces toward me in unison. I staggered back out into the daylight, gasping, and when I looked at the door frame, I saw another spiral slash carved into the lintel, faint and weathered but still cold to the touch, and I understood then that the cabin had been claimed long ago, and whatever had lived here before me had not left by choice. I camped that night outside the cabin, too afraid to go further, too afraid to go back, and the forest stayed quiet around me. No voices, no whispers, only the constant hum in my chest and the faint glow of the carved trees surrounding me like a cage. And I knew then with a kind of bone, deep certainty that I was being driven somewhere, not chased, not hunted, but herded, like they were pushing me towards something waiting deeper in the Smokies, something older than the park, older than the mountains, maybe older than the earth itself, and every step I took was only drawing me closer. When sleep finally dragged me down, it brought dreams of the altar again, but this time I wasn't kneeling alone. Dozens of others were there around me, their eyes gouged, their mouths carved open, and from above a shape bent down, taller than the trees, its body nothing but lines carved in air, glowing and shifting like fireflies, arranged in impossible patterns. And as it reached for me, I heard the sharp voice again, cutting through the dream, this time louder than before, saying, "Hold on." And when I woke, the mark of the spiral slash was carved into the inside wall of my tent, cold against my cheek, where my face had pressed against the fabric in the night. When I woke with the spiral slash carved inside my tent, I thought at first I had scratched it myself in some half-dreaming state, but the lines were too straight, too precise, and the fabric around them was uncut, only stained, as if the mark had been burned into the nylon without tearing it. And when I pressed my cheek against it, the cold was so sharp it numbed my skin like ice. And I knew then that whatever voice had spoken to me was real, and it was trying to keep me alive, even as the forest closed in tighter. I packed fast that morning, my hands trembling so badly, I fumbled the zipper again and again. And when I finally got moving, the trail ahead seemed different, wider, almost like it was clearing a space for me. And for a moment, I thought maybe the worst had passed. Maybe the voice had bought me time. But the relief didn't last long, because after less than a mile I came upon something that made my stomach drop. A stone pillar rising out of the ground, taller than me, and carved from the same rough rock as the altar. I had seen before, its surface scored with hundreds of the 3-line marks, all seeping dark resin that steamed in the cool air. The ground around the pillar was bare. No leaves, no undergrowth, only soil, packed flat, like something had paced circles around it over and over. And as I drew closer, I felt the hum spike sharp until my knees buckled, and I had to steady myself against a tree. And when I looked up, I realized the trees flanking the pillar were not carved with 3 lines at all. They were marked with spirals and slashes, dozens of them overlapping until the bark was covered entirely, and those spirals glowed faint and cold, like frost patterns in moonlight. The clash of the 2 marks was so strong it made my vision blur. The hum rising from the pillar, the chill seeping from the spirals, until it felt like my body was being pulled in 2 directions, and I staggered back, choking on the pressure. And when I blinked, I saw them again, the tall, faceless figures ringed around the pillar, swaying in unison. But this time, they weren't watching me. They were pressing against the spirals, clawing at the cold light that held them back, and their glowing gouges sputtered like coals doused with water in. That moment I realized I was standing on a line of battle, not a literal battlefield with swords and guns, but something older, something deeper carved into the bones of the Smokies. A war of symbols, a war of sound, the hum against the silence. And I was caught in the middle, unarmed and unprepared. The sharp voice came again, then cutting into my skull like a blade, saying, "Move now before they break through." And I ran without thinking, crashing through brush and stumbling down the slope until the forest closed around me again, and the hum softened, though it never left completely. It never left at all. The trail dipped into another hollow where the ground was soft and wet, and I nearly tripped over what I thought was a log until I looked closer and saw it was a body half sunk in the mud, pale skin stretched tight over bone clothes, shredded and rotting, the gouges carved across the face glowing faintly even in daylight. And I knew then it was the missing hiker, the one from the flyer at the trailhead, except he was not missing anymore. He had been claimed. His backpack was still strapped to his shoulders, torn and waterlogged. But when I reached down with shaking hands, I saw the same spiral slash symbol burned into the fabric, faint and frayed, but still cold. And I realized he had been fighting too, just like me, carrying the same warnings, carving the same marks, until the forest swallowed him whole. And the voice that had whispered to me might have been his once, or maybe it still was. I left the pack there, unable to carry it, though guilt gnawed at me with every step, because I felt like I was abandoning him again. But the hum grew louder the longer I lingered, and I knew I had to move before they closed in. And when I finally forced myself onward, I saw more of them along the trail. Not just him, but others' old bodies, half hidden in the soil bones, twisted bark grown over them, like the forest had swallowed them. And in the faint glow of their gouges, I could see spirals carved into the ground near each one, like graves marked not for remembrance but for warning. By late afternoon, the sky darkened again, clouds heavy though no rain fell, and the air grew sharp with the smell of iron and resin, and I stumbled into another clearing larger than the last, and at its center rose a stone arch built from slabs stacked and balanced with impossible precision, the lintel carved with the 3 lines glowing bright enough to throw shadows across the clearing, and beneath it the air shimmered like heat rising from asphalt. Even though the air around me was freezing, I knew instinctively that this was a gate, not a metaphorical one, not a poetic one, but a real opening to somewhere I did not want to see. And the hum pouring from it was so strong, my chest vibrated like a drum, my teeth rattling in my skull, and through it I heard the layered voices chanting, "Not yours, not yours, not yours," in a rising wave until it filled every corner of my head. The sharp voice cut through again, screaming, "Don't look, don't look." But I couldn't help it. My eyes locked on the shimmer beneath the arch, and for just a second I saw through it, not forest, not mountain, not sky, but a place made of lines, endless lines carved in air, glowing red and white and twisting into shapes. My brain could not hold shapes that bent wrong and kept bending, until my stomach lurched and bile rose in my throat, and I tore my gaze away, falling to my knees in the dirt. When I blinked, the clearing was empty, the arch still there, but the shimmer gone as if it had closed for now, and the hum dropped back to its steady drone. But I knew then what the forest had been herding me toward, not just an altar, not just carved trees, but a door to somewhere older than the Smokies, older than anything human, and the figures that haunted me were not the masters of it. They were only the servants, the doorkeepers, and the hum was not their voice but the voice of whatever waited beyond. I crawled out of the clearing on hands and knees, too weak to stand, until the sharp voice steadied me, saying, "Keep moving, keep moving." And when I finally pushed myself upright, the trees around me bore more spirals, more slashes, cold and sharp as winter air, and I followed them like breadcrumbs, desperate for any direction that was not toward the gate. Night fell fast as though the sky had been pulled shut like a curtain, and I had no strength left to set my tent, so I collapsed beneath a tree marked with a spiral and pressed my back against it, the cold seeping into me like an anchor. And I prayed, though I hadn't prayed in years, not to God, not to anything in particular, just a desperate plea to whoever had left these marks to keep me alive until morning. And for the first time since Big Creek Trailhead, the hum faded almost entirely, replaced by silence so heavy it rang in my ears. Sleep came hard and fast, and with it, dreams not of the altar, not of the gate, but of a hand pale and scarred, reaching out of the dark to pull me upward, and I woke with my own hand outstretched, grasping nothing but empty air. Morning never really came that day, not in the way it should have. The sky stayed a flat gray, like someone had drained all the color from the world, and the air was so still, the trees barely stirred, and for the first time since stepping into the Smokies, I realized I couldn't hear birdsong or insects, or even the faint rustle of squirrels. Nothing but that low hum buried deep in my chest. Like a second heartbeat, I dragged myself upright from beneath the spiral-marked tree, my joints aching like I had aged 20 years overnight. And for a long moment, I just stood there gripping my trekking pole and trying to decide which way to move forward or back. But the woods didn't give me a choice. The trail ahead glowed faint with cold spirals, carved into the dirt itself, etched so deep. The earth looked branded, and though every instinct in me screamed to turn and run, I knew the way back no longer existed, not for me. As I walked, the spirals led me like a chain, each one burning with the same frostbite chill, and though the hum never faded completely, it stayed distant, almost muted, and I thought maybe the protective force was winning. Maybe it was pushing the other back. But then I started noticing changes in the forest. The trees were taller, but not natural. Their trunks smooth as bone, rising straight up without branches, until far above the canopy, spread in a tangle that blocked the sky, and their bark was marked entirely with carvings layer upon layer of spirals and slashes and gouges, fighting each other until the surface looked like scar tissue. The air grew thinner the deeper I went, like I was climbing altitude, even though the trail sloped downward into another hollow, and my breaths came shallow, quick my headlight and spinning, and in that haze I almost walked straight into it, a wall of fog that cut across the hollow, like a curtain, dense and unmoving, though no breeze touched it. And when I reached out, my fingers sank in and came back wet cold enough to burn. The sharp voice came again, then close enough it felt like it was whispering right behind my ear, saying through, don't stop through. And before I could hesitate, the fog sucked me inside, and the world vanished. For a moment I thought I'd gone blind. The white was so total, I couldn't see my own hands. But then shapes began to form around me. Not solid, not whole. Just outlines in the mist. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Tall, faceless bodies bending and swaying the same as before. Except here they were, close, so close their edges brushed mine as I stumbled forward, and the hum swelled until I thought my skull would split. I pressed on, guided by the faint frost glow of a spiral appearing ahead in the fog, and every time I reached one another would flare further on, leading me step by step through the press of faceless shapes, and though they swayed and bent, none of them touched me, not directly, but I felt their pull of gravity dragging at my skin, like they were trying to draw me off the path and into their sway. At one point, I slipped my boot, catching on a root hidden in the fog, and as I pitched sideways, one of the shapes bent low arms stretching toward me, and I swear I felt fingers brush my shoulder. Not flesh, not bone, but something colder than ice. And when I shoved myself upright, the skin there was numb and gray, like frostbite, and the voice screamed, "Move so loud my ears rang." I don't know how long I walked like that. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. But when the fog finally broke, I stumbled into another clearing. This one ringed not with trees, but with stones. Massive upright slabs arranged in a circle, each one carved with spirals and slashes alternating, like the two forces had marked their territory, side by side, and at the center stood another altar, larger than the last, its surface smooth but empty. No gouges, no blood, just a hollow carved basin that looked ready to be filled. I fell to my knees, too weak to stand, and as I knelt, I heard the layered voices rise again. Not yours, not yours, not yours, in a fevered chant, and this time I saw them at the edge of the stone circle. The faceless shapes pressed tight against an unseen barrier, clawing to get through, and for the first time I realized they weren't in control. Here they were held back by the spirals, carved into half the stones, just as much as I was held by them. The sharp voice came softer now, not shouting, not desperate, but steady, like someone kneeling beside me saying, "You can stop it. You can close the way." And when I looked down at the altar, I saw my own reflection in the basin, but it wasn't me. Not exactly. My face was marked with spirals, carved into the skin, my eyes cold and white, glowing faint in the dim light. I jerked back, gasping, but the reflection didn't move. It only stared, and then its mouth opened, though mine stayed shut, and I heard it speak in the same sharp voice I had been hearing all along, saying, "You are not the first, but you might be the last." Before I could make sense of that, the hum surged again, rattling the stones, and cracks split across the slabs marked with spirals. The light dimming, and the faceless shapes howled soundless, but furious as they pressed harder against the barrier. And I realized the protection was failing, the balance breaking, and if I didn't act, they would flood the clearing and drag me into whatever gate waited beyond. My voice said carve, and though I had nothing in my hands but my trekking pole, I gripped it tight and drove the tip into the altar surface, and to my shock, it cut clean through the stone, like it was soft clay spirals flaring to life beneath the pole's path, and the hum shrieked ire and protest, until blood poured from my nose and ears. But still, carved circle after circle, slash after slash, until the basin blazed with frost light. The faceless shapes reeled, clawing at their carved marks, their glowing gouges sputtering like dying embers. And with one final push, I drove the spiral closed at the basin's center, and the hum cut out entirely, leaving only silence. For the first time since I entered the Smokies, I felt nothing. No hum, no pressure, no pull, just a silence. So thick it rang in my skull, and I collapsed against the altar, trembling, as the frost glow dimmed, leaving only the gray sky above. When I woke later, the clearing was empty. The stone still cracked the altar, still carved, but the faceless shapes gone, and for a moment I thought I had done it, that it was over, but then saw fresh marks on the trees leading out of the circle. Not spirals, not slashes, but the 3 lines deep and glowing red, and I understood with a sinking weight that all I had done was draw attention to myself, louder, brighter than ever, and the silence was only the breath before the scream. The silence didn't last long, maybe a minute, maybe less before the hum returned. Not as a steady drone this time, but as a pulse. A slow rhythmic throb that made the ground tremble under my boots, like a giant heartbeat buried beneath the mountain, and each pulse sent a shiver through my ribs, rattling me from the inside out. And I knew the gate was stirring, that my carving had not closed it, but woken it. I stumbled out of the stone circle, following the faint trail cut into the dirt by the 3 glowing lines. And as I walked, the forest changed again, this time faster than before, trees splitting open in slow cracks, spilling sap that smelled of blood, rocks rising from the ground, shaped into crude faces, each gouged with glowing marks, and the sky overhead bending, warping, as though the clouds were being pulled toward a single point. I could not see. I passed a tree split wide like a rib cage, and inside hung another body strung up in roots, pale and shriveled and carved with spirals, this one still faintly glowing. And as I stared, the eyes snapped open, white and lidless, and the mouth split in a grin carved far too wide. And I bolted down the trail, tripping over roots, heart hammering against the pulsing ground. The voice came again, but this time it was not sharp or clear. It was afraid, like radio static breaking apart, and it said, "They see you. They hear you louder than ever now." And I tried to answer out loud, my voice cracking in the still air, but no words came, just a dry rasp, and I realized my throat was raw, my tongue split and bleeding, though I had no memory of biting it. The trail spilled me into another hollow, this one wider than the others, and filled with water. Not a pond, not a lake, but a black mirror stretching across the ground, reflecting nothing, Not the sky, not the trees, only a shifting pattern of lines glowing red and white, swirling like a whirlpool, with no surface and no depth. And standing at the far bank were dozens of faceless figures, swaying in unison, their gouges brighter than ever, burning through the fog that rolled low across the water. I didn't dare step closer, but the ground beneath me cracked, pulsing with the same rhythm as the gate. And before I could retreat, the dirt split wide and roots whipped up around my ankles, yanking me forward, dragging me to the water's edge until my reflection shone in the black mirror. And this time, it wasn't me marked with spirals or slashes, but something else, entirely a face, carved of shifting lines rearranging themselves faster than I could follow, until it wasn't a face at all but a map, a design, an instruction, written in symbols my brain could not process without tearing at the edges. The hum roared in my skull, and the faceless figures across the water raised their arms in unison, swaying harder until their bodies bent at impossible angles. And I thought they would break, but they only bent further, their limbs cracking without sound, their faceless heads bowing toward the water as the patterns in it spun faster and faster. The voice cut through, then faint as if from a great distance, saying, "Not yet, not here, not like this." And suddenly the spirals flared around me, dozens carved into the ground trees, stones all at once burning with cold light, and the roots recoiled, shriveling back into the soil. The water's surface shuddered like a struck drum, and the reflection shattered, leaving only black stillness. I fell backward, gasping, shaking mud from my boots, and when I lifted my head, the figures across the bank were gone, but the hum remained louder than ever, pulsing so hard the trees around me swayed, though no wind touched them, and the dirt under my palms was hot, like coals. I staggered on, deeper into the forest, the trail twisting, narrowing until it felt like it was funneling me somewhere, deliberate each turn, sharper each slope, steeper, until the trees gave way entirely to stone, bare ridges rising around me, and the ground split with deep fissures glowing faint red from within, like the mountain itself was cracking open, and every pulse of the hum widened them just a little more. By dusk, I reached the ridge top and saw it spread below me in a valley that should not have existed, a vast pit in the earth, spiraling downward into black, and at its center, the arch I had seen before, only larger, towering hundreds of feet high, glowing lines carved across its surface, pulsing in time, with the hum and the air around it bending, warping as though reality itself was softening, tearing at the seams. Figures lined the spiral path leading down into the pit, countless faceless bodies swaying their glowing gouges, forming a river of light. And as I stared, the hum swelled into something almost like words. "Not yours, not yours, not yours, until my knees buckled and blood poured from my ears. The voice broke through, again, faint, broken, but insistent, saying, hold the line, carve again, hold them back. And I fumbled for my trekking pole, carving spirals into the rock at my feet. But the stone cracked instead of yielding, the marks splintering useless, and I realized that the closer I drew to the gate, the weaker the spirals became, until even their frost glow flickered like dying embers. Night fell. Without stars, the sky above warped into shifting patterns of red and white lines that moved like veins across flesh. And though I tried to look away, my eyes burned, seared with after images, until every blink showed me the same endless map etched behind my lids. And I thought, if I stared too long, I would become one of the faceless figures swaying in unison arms. Raised to the sky, I pressed my back against the ridge wall, carving one last spiral into the dirt, though it flickered dim and cold, and I prayed again, not to God, not to anything, but to whoever had carved before me, to whoever had left these warnings, to whoever had whispered in my skull that they would not let me fall into that pit. And for a moment, I thought I felt a hand on my shoulder steadying me, cold but human steady. But then the hum surged again and the ground split wide, and I saw light rising from the pit, brighter than day swallowing the valley whole. The last thing I remember before the light took me was the voice screaming, not yours, not yet, and then nothing but white. When the white light swallowed everything, I thought that was the end, that I had finally been pulled across the threshold, and whatever waited beyond would strip me down to nothing but lines and hum. But when my vision cleared, I was still in the Mount Smokies, or at least some reflection of them. The ridge gone, the valley gone, replaced by an endless spiral path of stone, curving downward into black. The arch rising at the center, so tall its top was lost in the warped sky, and all along the path, the faceless figures swayed in perfect rhythm, their gouges blazing bright red and white, until the whole spiral glowed like a wound in the earth. I tried to turn back, but there was nowhere to go behind me. Only more stone spiraling downward the way, outgone, erased, and the hum pressed so deep into my chest, I felt my ribs bend with every pulse, my breath stuttering in sync, until I realized I was swaying too, my knees bending my body, shifting to match their rhythm, and with horror, I understood that was how it started. You didn't become faceless all at once. You bent and swayed until you were hollow enough to be carved. The sharp voice cut through faint, but still there saying, fight it, carve. And though my hands shook so hard, I could barely grip the trekking pole. I slammed it into the stone at my feet, dragging it across the surface. And to my relief, the spiral flared to life, cold and sharp, pushing the rhythm, back just enough for me to still myself again, and I staggered down the path, step by step, carving at every turn, each spiral flickering dimmer than the last, but still holding. The deeper I went, the louder the hum grew, until it was no longer sound, but pressure waves rattling my teeth, cracking the stone beneath my boots, and the faceless figures leaned toward me, arms stretching longer than they should, their glowing gouges splitting wider like mouths opening. Though no sound came, only the hum pouring from the arch above. Halfway down, I stumbled into a chamber carved into the wall of the spiral path, its entrance marked by spirals and slashes tangled together. And inside, I found remnants of people, real people. Old gear, rusted lanterns, shredded tents, and across the walls, dozens of spirals cut deep, some flaring faintly, others burned out entirely. And in the center lay a body desiccated but intact, its hand still clutching a knife carved into the hilt with spirals. And when I touched it, the cold surged so sharp, it numbed my arm to the elbow. The voice came, again, clearer now, stronger through the knife, saying, "Take it, finish it." And I understood then that whoever this had been, they were the one who came before me. Maybe the same hiker from the flyer, maybe someone even earlier, and they had fought as I was fighting, but had not made it out. I carried the knife with me down the rest of the spiral path, the faceless figures drawing closer with every step, their arms brushing my shoulders, leaving patches of numb gray skin wherever they touched, and I carved frantically with the knife, each spiral flaring, brighter than the pole had managed, each one cutting the hum just enough to keep me upright. At the base of the spiral path, the ground opened into a vast floor of stone, cracked and bleeding, light, and at its center, the arch towered higher than any building I had ever seen, its surface alive with shifting lines crawling like insects, glowing red and white, and the air beneath it rippled not like heat, but like fabric stretched thin, ready to tear. And through those ripples I glimpsed shapes vast and wrong, bodies made of nothing but lines, rearranging endlessly into patterns that burned my eyes and twisted my stomach, until I doubled over, vomiting into the cracks. The faceless figures ringed the arch, swaying, their gouges blazing, and the hum swelled into a crescendo, so loud it wasn't sound anymore. It was thought it was command. It was inside me screaming, "Not yours, not yours, not yours," until I dropped to my knees, clawing at my ears, blood slicking my fingers. The voice cut through then, the clearest it had ever been, sharp as broken glass, saying, "One chance carve the seal now." And I looked down at the knife, heavy in my hand, its spirals blazing cold, and I knew what it wanted. I had to carve one last spiral into the base of the arch, Close the gate, seal it forever, even if it burned me out with it. I forced myself forward each step, like wading through concrete, the hum trying to freeze me in place, my legs locking my chest, convulsing until I thought my ribs would snap. But still I crawled to the base of the arch and pressed the knife into the stone, and it cut like flesh, the surface parting to spill black tar that steamed in the cold air. The spirals flared to life, racing across the surface of the arch, fighting the red and white lines, twisting with them until the stone shook the ground, splitting wide, light spearing into the warped sky, and the faceless figures screamed soundless but violent, their bodies snapping backward, bending until they shattered into dust that blew away on a wind I couldn't feel. The gate roared, the hum splitting into 1,000 voices, shrieking at once. Not yours, not yours, not yours. But beneath them all, I heard the sharp voice, steady, calm, saying, yours now. And in that moment, I understood it wasn't just fighting for me. It was fighting through me. It had been trapped in this war longer than I could imagine. And now, it had chosen me as its blade. I carved deeper, the knife sinking to the hilt, the spirals racing faster across the arch, until the lines of red and white buckled, twisted, collapsed, and with a sound like stone screaming, the arch cracked, split down the middle, and the rippling fabric beneath it tore wide. For just a second, I saw through to the other side, not endless lines, not faceless figures, but a vast shape coiled and waiting, older than the mountains, older than the world, a shape that looked back at me, and in that instant, every spiral, every slash, every gouge made sense. All of it was not a warning, but a map, a language, a way to keep it locked away. And then the crack closed, the light died, and the arch fell silent, its surface dull stone again, the hum gone, the figures gone, only me left, kneeling in the dust, the knife burned black in my hand, the spirals etched into it dead and cold. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was emptiness, like something had been torn out of me. With a hum, and in the silence I realized I could still hear faint whispers, not the hum, not the faceless chorus, but the sharp voice softer than before, almost gentle, saying, it's not over, not yet. When the arch cracked and fell silent, and the hum finally bled out of the air, I stayed kneeling in the dust for what felt like hours, my hands locked around the dead knife, the spirals etched into it, cold and lifeless, and I thought maybe I had ended it. Maybe the thing on the other side had been pushed back, and the Smokies would breathe again. But then I realized the silence wasn't clean. It wasn't whole. It was waiting, and I could still hear the faintest murmur at the edge of my thoughts, like a heartbeat too soft to notice unless you were listening. I forced myself to my feet, legs trembling, lungs raw with blood and dust, and I stumbled back up the spiral path, each step heavier than the last, as if the mountain itself was pressing me down. And though the faceless figures were gone, the gouges they left still glowed faint across the stone, and in the afterimage I saw them swaying arms, raised heads bowed like shadows burned into the walls of the pit, and I knew they were not destroyed, only held back, waiting for the rhythm to return. Halfway up, I passed the chamber where I had found the body with the knife, and now the spirals carved across its walls were gone, erased, smoothed over, as if the stone had healed itself and the body too was gone. Nothing left but dust, and I wondered if the voice that had guided me had finally taken what remained of him to wherever it had come from, leaving only me in its place. By the time I reached the ridge top, the warped sky had cleared the clouds, normal again, gray and heavy with the promise of rain, and the trees around me swayed with a real wind, not the pull of the hum. And for a moment I thought maybe I had made it back to the world I knew. But then I saw the trail ahead, carved with fresh spirals, cut deep into the dirt, still cold, still glowing faintly. And I realized they weren't there before. They had been carved for me. I followed them because there was nowhere else to go. The forest closing in again, though quieter than before. No humming, no swaying figures, only silence broken by the crunch of my boots and the hiss of wind through leaves. And as I walked, I saw more spirals, not just on trees and rocks, but on the ground itself, cut into roots, into fallen logs, into the sides of boulders, each one newer, fresher, as if someone was walking just ahead of me, carving them in real time. The voice came again, then softer than ever, not sharp, not commanding, but almost tired, saying, "Keep walking, almost home." And I wanted to scream at it to tell me what home even meant, because I didn't believe anymore that the trailhead, the car, the world outside these woods was waiting for me. And yet, I kept walking step after step, because the only other choice was to sit down and let the silence swallow me whole. By dusk, I had reached the edge of Big Creek Trailhead or something that looked like it, the parking lot, empty. The signs weathered but standing, and my car still there, though it looked wrong. The paint, dull the windows, fogged the air inside, thick with resin. When I opened the door and sat down behind the wheel, the seat felt damp cold, as if it had been waiting for years. And when I checked the dashboard, the clock blinked nonsense symbols, red and white lines twisting into spirals that flickered and vanished before I could focus. I started the engine anyway, the key turning smooth, the headlights cutting through the trees, and I drove down the winding road, my hands tight on the wheel, my eyes flicking to the mirrors every few seconds. And though the forest looked normal now, just autumn trees and quiet ridges. I kept catching glimpses in the glass, tall, faceless shapes swaying in the distance, spirals carved into bark, glowing faintly in the beam of the lights. The time I reached the first gas station outside the park, the sky was fully dark, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. And for the first time in days, maybe weeks, I heard a sound that wasn't the hum, wasn't the voice, just the buzz of electricity and the chatter of a radio inside, and it almost broke me. I almost cried right there behind the wheel. But when I stepped out onto the pavement, the cold hit me sharp and sudden, and I looked down to see spirals carved into the dirt beneath the tires, fresh and faintly glowing. I told myself it was just a trick, just my mind seeing patterns after everything. But when I went inside, the clerk looked up and froze his eyes wide and glassy, and I realized he wasn't looking at me. Not exactly. He was looking at something behind me, something carved into the air itself. And I turned slowly, and for just a second, I saw it, a spiral hanging there, faint, glowing, and cold, before it winked out like breath on glass. The voice came one last time, then soft, steady, saying, "Not over, never over." And I understood finally what it had meant all along. I had not closed the gate. I had only taken its place, become its keeper, its knife, its seal, and the spirals that followed me were not warnings, but anchors tying it shut, tying me to it, and as long as I lived it would remain closed. But when I was gone, when my body failed, when my mind broke, it would open again. I drove home that night, my headlights catching spirals carved into every mile marker, every tree along the roadside, every reflection in the glass. And when I finally reached my house, I sat in the car for hours, staring at the front door, unable to step inside because I knew the spirals would follow me there too. They were already carved into me, burned into my bones, and I could feel them cold in my chest. With every breath, I don't know how long I can carry it. Maybe years, maybe days. But I know this. If you ever hike Big Creek Trailhead and you see spirals carved into the trees, turn back while you can, because if you follow them too far, if you hear the hum, if you feel the pull, then it's already too late, and you'll end up like me, carving spirals in the dirt, carving spirals in your skin, trying to hold the line until someone else takes your place. So this is my warning. This is my trailhead horror story. And if you're hearing it now, maybe you already know the truth. Maybe you've already seen the marks. Maybe the voice is already whispering in your ear, telling you to keep walking almost home.